Right after God shuts down the spiritual gateway at Babel, we have the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And somehow Abram finds himself in Egypt after a famine strikes the land. But if you pay close attention, this story is bridging two significant biblical events together. Not only is there a glimpse into the future here, but there's a callback to the past. And when you see it, this small story will blow your mind. So what's really happening when Abram goes down to Egypt? Why does he feel like he needs to trick Pharaoh? If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12:10 says, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." This is the last official teaching here on Genesis 12. To summarize, after Abram leaves his homeland of Babylon, God calls him out of Haran. God promises to give him a legacy and a name and all that. And Abram ends up stopping along two specific locations to worship God, and then a famine drives him to Egypt. Two words to capture Genesis 12 would be called out. Abram is called out. The famine in the land here is there are two stories that come to mind, and when you see how they connect here, this story is bridging two key biblical events together. It'll blow your mind. The way that it blew my mind, I think. In Genesis 26 verse 1, just to give you a little glimpse into the future, Abram will have a son named Isaac, okay? And Isaac will have to endure a famine in his lifetime, which causes him to have to move to the land of the Philistines, if you're familiar with the Philistines. The author will tell us the last famine was in the days of Abraham, looking backward in hindsight. So you're supposed to see a comparison being drawn between Abram and Isaac and both the famines they endure and how Egypt is a part of both their stories. Then God actually appears to Isaac in the midst of that famine and says, hey, don't go down to Egypt. So we have God appearing, the patriarch moving, the famine happening, and then a promise of blessing and abundance, just as we have right here in verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 10 and 11. Because right before this event of Abram leaving the land to go to Egypt, God just showed up and gave him a promise about the land and his descendants. But here Abram goes down to Egypt. So a question I have is, was Abram supposed to respond like this? Was he supposed to go to Egypt? Did God tell Abram to do this and we don't have it recorded? Or did Abram actually move out of fear and react to his environment in his own human wisdom without consulting God? If we consider what God does with Isaac in Genesis 26, in this exact situation, we might be able to conclude that God actually did not want Abram going down to Egypt. Though the text doesn't tell us that explicitly, we might be able to draw that conclusion. And this could be a different situation, but it just seems unlikely when I read the story. Whether or not Abram fell out of the will of God here, we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful that we don't begin to move out of fear and make decisions out of pure self-preservation. We have to make sure that we consult God in all things rather than purely reacting to our environment and our circumstances. And prayer is how we discern the right move to make in any given situation. Sometimes what seems to offer us the most safety and the most protection will actually lead us into more problems that God wanted to spare us from. Fear of lack cannot move us. And any kind of fear cannot be the driving voice of our life. And the fact that he goes down to Egypt, of all the places, why did Abram choose to go down to Egypt? What did he know about Egypt? Did he have any history with Egypt or knowledge of that country? Did Egypt have a reputation? Or did he just have a general direction and he found himself in Egypt? Throughout the Bible, I want us to consider that there will be this repeating theme of people either going down to Egypt or desiring to go back to Egypt. We'll see Joseph in Genesis. He'll go down to Egypt. He'll be taken to Egypt, and he'll be there during another famine that will hit the land of Canaan. And then Joseph's family, Jacob is his father, his family will come down to him at Egypt to escape the famine. And we already saw how in Genesis 26, Isaac is essentially tempted to do the same, except God warns him. And in Exodus and Numbers, the people of Israel will experience a kind of hunger and a lack that drives them to want to go back to Egypt for the food that was there. In 2 Kings chapter 25, the people of Judah will try and escape from King Nebuchadnezzar and the judgment that's coming through him, and they'll seek refuge in Egypt under Pharaoh's wing. Hosea actually speaks about how foolish Israel is for running to Egypt in times of terror when Nebuchadnezzar's coming as well, or rather Assyria, seeking protection from Egypt or in Egypt. And then in Matthew chapter 2, we have the toddler Jesus escaping King Herod because, well, his parents decide to bring him to Egypt, which fulfills prophecy. So there's this theme throughout the Bible of people running to Egypt, and in every case, except with Jesus, it seems to be a negative thing. Either it's a decision made out of fear or blatant disobedience to God, but every time except with Jesus in Matthew 2, it seems to note a lack of trust in God. So that may likely be what's happening here with Abram when he goes down to Egypt to escape the famine. Interestingly enough, Abram will end up having an Egyptian servant whom he acquired somehow, likely in Haran, possibly here, and she and her offspring, Hagar, will become a huge part of the story. And then there is a famine here. We gotta address the elephant in the room. We're all wondering, why did God call Abram to a place where God knew there'd be a famine? Why did God allow a famine to happen to his chosen covenant partner? We would expect God to protect Abram and to keep him from such bad circumstances, but God seemed to lead Abram right into it. And sometimes God will lead his people around the chaos and trouble, and we get to avoid it. And at other times, he asks us to follow him right into the valley of the shadow of death and to trust him. And we need to learn how to discern in each situation what God is actually asking of us to do. It won't always be the same all across the board, but being chosen by God does not mean that we're exempt from trouble. It actually means we have God's favor and we have his presence in the midst of it. Now, after going down to Egypt, look at what Abram does, or look at what he says, rather, to his wife and half-sister Sarah, or Sarai. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "Look, I know that you're a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, 'This is his wife,' and then they're going to try and kill me. But they'll let you live. So, can you do me a favor? Say that you're my sister, so that it goes well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful, just like Abram anticipated. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. So exactly what Abram expected them to do. Abram is at least 75. Let's think about this for a second. Abram is 75 at least, and his wife is 10 years younger. But she ain't super young. So how beautiful was this woman, who was probably pushing 70, that Abram knew the Egyptians would really want her? And what does this reveal about Abram? That he's scheming up a plan based on his assumption that the Egyptians will want to take his wife. And why is the story highlighting this moment in Abram's life and the conversation that takes place between him and Sarah? I think there's something deeper happening in this conversation we're supposed to see. And then verse 12, when it says, the Egyptians might see you and they'll say, "This is his wife. Let's kill him and we can just have his wife." I just have a question, like, what experiences previously has Abram already had with Egypt? Like, what did he hear or know about them? What was their reputation? How did he know they would react this way? The way that they did to want Sarah's beauty. Was this just a general knowledge of mankind? And Abram's like, people are pretty wicked. Or did Abram have some history with the Egyptians already? We know he has an Egyptian servant named Hagar at some point. So maybe that gives us a better idea. And then there's this fear of dying. We don't know if the Egyptians would have ever done this, or if this was just an irrational fear of Abram. They did take her, they did want her, so maybe he was right about the fact that they would have killed him too. But either way, we have to be careful not to let hypothetical scenarios and assumptions drive our decisions. We have to be extra careful as believers that we don't make decisions based on irrational fears that are likely to never even happen. So, whatever the case, we need to be careful not to assume, and actually we need to consult God first so that we don't get into trouble. We don't see Abram here consulting God at all. What did I write in my notes? We don't see Abram consulting God here at all, or even building an altar to bring God into this situation like we saw at the last two places. We see Abram scheming on his own and using his wife as a shield for himself. He knows that he can use his wife to preserve his own life and guarantee his own safety. And this is actually a very real temptation for many of us. The temptation is to use and view other people as a means to guarantee our own safety and preserve our own selves. even if it's at a cost to them. And this is just not what God desires of us. He wants us to trust that he's got our back and that we don't need to use other people as body shields like Abram ends up doing here with his own wife and half-sister Sarah. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at abovereproachministry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believers section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. And then verse 13, things become eerily reminiscent of a previous story we've seen. Verse 13 says, I want you to say this, okay, Sarah, listen to me. When we get to the Egyptians, tell them you're my sister, so that it goes well with me because of you. Like, if they like you, that'll fall onto me, and my life will be spared for your sake. This is technically true that Sarah's his sister, but it's not the complete truth. Abram's using a half-truth to cover his own butt, and he's convincing his wife to participate in his scheme. He knows that he can ride on the coattails of her beauty to be treated well by the Egyptians. In other words, her favor will be extended to Abram, and Abram doesn't yet trust God the way he will later on. His relationship with God is still very much in its infancy, and it's developing. Abram, by no stretch of the imagination, is perfect, especially if we see decisions like this. Yet God still chooses to work with this man, knowing full well the mistakes Abram's going to make. And yet Abram is still not disqualified. And when God chooses us to be his children, he knows exactly what he's getting himself into. He knows that we'll fail along the way, but he still chooses to graciously work with us and use us anyway. Verse 15 says, And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. I'm going to come back to something I want to reference in Genesis chapter 3. But for now, the fact that the woman is taken. If Abram knew the kind of people that were in Egypt, why the heck did he go down there and let them take his wife? How was he okay with his wife being taken by another man into his house? Verse 16 says, And for her sake, guess what? Pharaoh actually ended up giving favor to Abram and dealt well with him. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, camels, all the stuff that is valuable he gives to Abram because of Sarah. So just like Abram predicted, Pharaoh dealt well with him by preserving his life, for sure. He didn't kill him, but not only that, I think Abram didn't anticipate that Pharaoh would give him lots of stuff. So I just have a question. Why would Pharaoh give lots of gifts to Abram just for being the brother of this beautiful woman? Was this a kind of transaction taking place and a payment being made to Abram? Or is this like the gifts that we see Abram's servant? Later on, Abram's going to send his servant to his brother's house to find a wife for his son Isaac. And then Abram's servant is going to bring gifts to Rebekah and her brother and her mother as a kind gesture. Is that what's happening here? Or is this like a bride price kind of deal? Verse 17, right after the gifts we see and the kindness Pharaoh shows to Abram, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. So we have great plagues, we have Pharaoh, we have Egypt, and we have one of God's chosen messengers. Interesting. What does that sound like? So just looking at this, it's because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Now we already know Sarah's Abram's wife. Why tell us all these different times? And what did the Lord exactly do to Pharaoh and his house? What were these great plagues? How long was this going on before Pharaoh realized, I think we made a mistake. I think there's a divine hand behind this. And what convinced Pharaoh that there was a God behind this? How did he come to know that Sarah was actually Abram's husband? How many plagues took place? All these different questions that we can't answer, but it just makes you think a little. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me?" He called Abram and says, What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Look, here's your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him. What did he order the men to do? Not sure. And they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Possibly the order is, hey, send Abram and his wife away. But let's backtrack a little bit. There are a few details we really need to break down. In verse 18, when Pharaoh goes, "What have you done to me?" that's very reminiscent of what God said to the serpent. "What have you done?" Or to Adam, "What have you done?" Or to Cain, "What have you done?" Your brother's blood cries out from the ground. Or what Noah told Ham, when Noah realized what Ham did to him. There's this "what have you done" kind of situation that takes place. So this story right here fits perfectly into the template that we see in Genesis 3, which becomes recycled over and over throughout the stories. And then I want to think about how this story foreshadows the Exodus narrative. Okay, so we have the king of Egypt here, Pharaoh. We have Pharaoh taking a bride that technically belongs to someone else. We have great plagues that come on Egypt, whatever those were. And we have God doing these things on behalf of this wife or bride that belongs to Abram, because a wife was taken or a bride was taken. We have someone scheming to use another human for their own benefit, Abram, going, "Sarah, listen to what I'm saying. Let's do this." Abram schemes this whole thing up like Pharaoh does in Exodus when he abuses the Israelites, and he schemes a plan to kind of oppress them and keep them weak and use them for his own labor force. And then we have Abram and Sarah being sent out strongly by Pharaoh at the end, just as we see at the Exodus. And then we have Abram gaining many possessions throughout this event. He ends up coming out and leaving with more than he came in with. And this is all the elements of the Exodus story. The people of Israel are referred to throughout the scriptures as the covenantal bride of Yahweh. They're a symbolic bride and wife to God in that covenant sense. Pharaoh takes the bride that is not his at the Exodus story, uses them for his own benefit. Plagues come on Egypt. Pharaoh eventually drives them out forcefully and angrily after his firstborn dies. And then the Israelites end up plundering Egypt on the way out, so that they leave with more than what they came with. And God brings out his people. Considering Abram's history with Egypt and the fact that he has an Egyptian servant, Hagar, it makes a lot of sense why we see Egypt oppressing Israel in the Exodus story, based on their relationship history and where they're at. And then, before we close with verse 20, I want to go back and make a few observations and connections to Genesis chapter 3, okay? So think about the components of the Genesis 3 story. We have a man and his wife. Right here we have Abram, and we have his wife Sarah, just like we see in the Genesis 3 story. The woman here is being told something. Just like in Genesis 3, the serpent creeps up to Eve and goes, "Did God really say?" And here we have a woman that's beautiful in appearance. She's attractive. She's desirable. The Egyptians will take her, right? So in the Genesis 3 narrative, we have the forbidden fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? That fruit is attractive, something to be desired, right? And then we have Eve taking and reaching for that fruit. And then we see here Abram is actually motivated to tell Sarah this and to scheme this up. He's motivated by a fear of what might happen. Or in other words, there's something about what could happen or what might happen that motivates Abram to do what he does here. Same with Eve. The serpent gets her when he says, "You will be like God." So she's motivated by that. When she sees that, oh, I can know good and evil on my own terms, she takes and eats. And then there's this essence of, look, Abram's afraid that they'll kill him, but they'll let Sarah live. So there's life and death. Just like in Genesis 3, God tells Adam and Eve, look, I've given you life. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In that day you'll surely die. So there's a promise of life and this assurance of death if they disobey. And then the Egyptians end up, just like Abram said, if they see you, they're going to want you. Well, when Abram entered, the Egyptians saw the woman was beautiful, just like Eve sees the fruit is desirable and good to eat and good for food and pleasant to the eyes. And when they saw her, they took her into Pharaoh's house, just as Eve took the fruit. And then what's interesting is there is a consequence for Pharaoh taking what isn't his, and it's called the plagues. But here in this situation, Pharaoh isn't to be viewed as the one who's necessarily in the wrong. It's actually Abram. Because you have in Genesis 3, God calls Adam and goes, "What have you done?" Calls Eve, like, "What did the serpent do to you?" Tells the serpent, "What have you done?" That kind of thing. And here, in the place of God, narratively, Pharaoh is the one going, what have you done to me, Abram? Right? So there's consequences. There's that same kind of calling to hold someone accountable and to give consequences. And the consequence Pharaoh dispenses is that, well, Abram and Sarah are sent out. They're sent away. They're, in that sense, exiled. And after Adam and Eve eat from the tree, where are they sent? They're sent away from the tree of life in exile. And then Pharaoh gave orders to his men saying, look, send them away. But I think the men there are not just to play a role in sending them away, but to ensure they also don't come back in. And at the Genesis 3 story, we have God put cherubim with a flaming sword at the entrance to the garden, into the tree of life, at the east, so that Adam and Eve don't go back in. They guard the way back in. And I think the men here that Pharaoh orders are to kind of play that role as well, to ensure they don't come back into Egypt. And then, so if we put all this together, what you're going to see, unfortunately, the role that Abram plays in this story, not to negate the fact that God has called him, not to negate the role he's going to play later on, not to negate his righteousness and faith and all that, but to say at this moment in his life, where he's at in his relationship with God, and in this story, he's playing the role of the serpent. He's the one deceiving his wife, involving his wife into deceive the Egyptians and trick Pharaoh, and there's consequences. Not to say that Abram is definitively this evil guy, but in this moment, he's playing the role of the crafty serpent. Verse 20 says, and Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him. They sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Throughout this story, I just have a question. Where the heck is everyone else? Where's Lot? Where's Lot's wife? Where's the household of Abram? Why does it mention the wife and focus on her and Abram only in this story? And I think because we're getting a picture of who Abram and Sarah are at this point, as God is working with them. There's no record of Sarah disagreeing with Abram's plan to deceive Pharaoh. It doesn't mean she didn't, but we don't have that in the story recorded. We don't have Abram considering what might happen to the Egyptians and concerning himself with what if God might get involved and protect them. If God's called us, like maybe God. Abram doesn't consider any of that. He doesn't consider the consequences for his trickery. He was just concerned with himself. And this does not mean that Abram only ever cares about himself and only ever makes mistakes. But the first story, the first chapter that we get of Abram's life is this story about this covenant patriarch fleeing, not trusting God fully, scheming, using others, preserving himself. And I'm sure he had his wife in mind too, but it just seems to be all about Abram in this story. And as God works with him throughout the story, you'll see that Abram changes a lot. He progresses. He definitely gets sanctified in that sense. He becomes more of a faithful covenant partner to the Lord. But God, this is the application. God works with us where we're at. God is in no rush to change us all at once, or he would. He's patient to progressively develop and sanctify us along the way and even use us with all the flaws we bring to the table. God is sanctifying us progressively in no kind of rush, and this is the love and patience of God, is to know Abram's going to fail and still call him, is to know we're going to make mistakes and still not get it after years and still work with us and use us. So as we close chapter 12, it's ending on a pretty sad note. And yet the promise of God in the middle of this chapter, that I'll multiply you, I'll give you a nation, and at the beginning, that is to be the main focus of this story. Not Abram's failure, Not his deception, not him scheming, but the promises of God and the truth and faithfulness of God in the midst of that. So that's all we have for Genesis chapter 12. Next week, we'll get to Genesis 13. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. If you want to share your thoughts and questions about these studies, join us every Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a live discussion together. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit AboveReproachMinistry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.